So we are back with Dr. Eric Hall, our renowned friend, Catholic theologian, talking about Homebrewed Christianity, Guide to God. So today we're talking about chapter 4, for those of you that have the book. Chapters 4, 7, and 8, but we'll probably won't get through all of that. But anyways, last week, why don't you just give us a little recap of what we did last week?
So last week, we talked a lot about, I gave a bit of my story, how I went from a sort of, if you will, the sort of ultra-Pentecostal on into a more intellectual line of thinking, that this intellectuality was in itself religious for me. And I realized that whatever is true in any sense must be, if you will, caught up in and participate in the divine. Mm-hmm. So I took the truth of reason, to at least be a constitutive factor when we're trying to make declarations of faith, or when we're trying to discuss and interpret God. Then we talked about 5 different interpretations of God in the history of the West. First is Miyagi, which is classical theism. Second one is Jersey Shore, which is sort of the late medieval and early Reformation response to classical theism. The third is deism, which is the response to Jersey Shore God, and it's signified by the retired Oprah. The next is the British development of process thought in and through Alfred North Whitehead, which I signify through your hippie aunt, which we all have. And the final one is the hermeneutic tradition, which in many ways is a recapitulation, renewal, and restoration of Jersey Shore under the auspices of what it would mean to say that God is solely a love that draws us out of ourselves. I think that's kind of where we ended.
Yeah, I think that's a good recap. Thank you. All right, so let's get down to the dirty work, which really is what we have to do today.
I like it.
So chapter 4 is titled "Sifting the Beer from the Suds."
Indeed, amen.
Which essentially, for those watching, means that we're going to have to go through these different identities of God, these different conceptions of God, and figure out what we actually have.
Yep.
Okay, so I've gotten several reviews from people, one of which was that we should tone down our language, our theological language, because I think it was a fair critique. We got pretty metaphysical last time, which, is just going to happen sometimes. But let's do our best.
I will respond to that. Agreed. We will tone down our language, but I will also say up your philosophy. We're not doing stained glass. We are now talking through stained glass concepts. So I think this is a pertinent place whereby if you don't understand something, ask, look it up, try to develop it on your own. And that's what I would encourage anyone to do. So yeah, we will tone down the language, but also up your game.
Yeah. I like that. That's a challenge to everyone. So let's get a few terms out of the way. What is ontological primacy?
Ontological primacy, that would mean something like this. Let's see if we can do it in an example first. If you define me, you might say, you might try to give a definition like this. Hey, nice hair. You are your hair, right? And I would go, I'm not my hair. I just got my hair cut yesterday, and I don't feel like I've changed that much. Mm-hmm. And you might go, well, no, I'm pretty sure your hair, and I'm pretty sure you did change with your hair being changed. And I go, hold on. I got some ontological primacy here. And the ontological primacy I have pertains to my soul or myself, or the sort of invisible part of me that constitutes my character, my virtue, even my body. makes me who I am. So ontological primacy means this. What things are grounded in what? The blue of this hat, you might say, is not ontologically primal. The hat itself, the substance of the hat, is the primal thing that allows the blue to be. So when we're talking theologically and we're talking ontological primacy, oftentimes what we're asking is, who is primary? Does God come prior to me? And do I need to think through God first, or do I need to think through my own anthropological, my own sort of human developed concepts prior to thinking through God? That's one way in which it's used.
Mm-hmm.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, good. Yeah, because if I hadn't taken, my intro philosophy class first semester, I wouldn't know what ontological even meant. So
Sure.
Okay. Yes. So on the next page, 57 for your reference, you say Miyagi God stands as the identity underlying all other God definitions. Because he is identity, he's also the highest concept. All other understandings of God will invoke his existence indirectly. Why don't you explain that a little bit?
So this is my, other folks would call it an unfair critique. I think it's absolutely and perfectly fair. When we're talking the God of classical theism, which I remind you is not yet the God of the Christian faith, it gets reinterpreted through the Christian faith. But when we're talking the God of classical theism, what we're saying is, again, we talked about this last week, God is not a thing, an object in this room, an object in this world amongst other objects. In fact, God isn't even a thing at all. God is in some ways, hi Kitty, God is in some ways an act, an event, and God is the act and event of bringing things into being. So we say that God created. It is a far more pertinent, or I think honest way to say that God is the everlasting act of creation. So God is the act of being that continues to, if you will, ground and sustain our existence. And our existences are bound up with our identities. Here's what I mean. You and I have individual identities, right? So we have certain characteristics that define us, that other people would know us by.
Right.
And yet in both of us, we couldn't define these things without a common humanity. So the fact that I'm a little bit boorish, I tend to like bad and dirty jokes, stuff like this. This is in some ways not this depends on there being within me what I would call the universal or the essence of humanity that all of us share together. Mm-hmm. You could say that of cups, you could say that of dogs, you could say that of hats, you could say that of mice, doesn't matter. Definition draws us into identity and brings to us a reality. Again, this is technical, I understand. But this is where, if you want to understand God and the development of God in the West, you have to go here. Because the entire development of God in the West is bound up with how we think through the world. And I think that's an interesting recognition. So we either think that our humanity, in the case of theism, is somewhere, somehow a real thing that really grounds who we are, or we think, like in Jersey Shore, that that's just a term that we make up, that we're actually individuals. We make up terms and classify things so that we can usefully sort them out. I am not a nominalist. That's what Jersey Shore is, nominalism. Mm-hmm. I am a realist in the previous sense that there is a real humanity amongst us. Now, where does this notion of God come in, especially the notion of God as identity? Human nature is not, if you will, a self-creating, self-subsisting, or in any way necessary concept. It's contingent. It could have not been.
Good, yeah.
God, on the other hand, as the act of existing, grounds and is the source of all identities, whether it's human identity, dog identity, tree identity. I mean, doesn't matter. So when we say that God is the act of being, what we're also saying is God is the act and source of all identity in things, the one who grounds all of the, if you will, universals wherever we find them that make us up and allow us to become the individuals that we are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so why does that matter? Does any of this make sense? Let me let you question that a little bit to draw.
Yeah. So the very first critique or question is about change.
Sure.
And this is a very classical, like Aristotelian thought that we're dealing with. If God is the substrate to all of us, if God is the identity from which our identities proceed, is the process reversible? In our change, does God change?
My argument would be this: unless there is an absolute stability point that allows us to be and to change, there couldn't be any change whatsoever. So there needs to be something unchanging to allow for change.
So it seems somewhat paradoxical.
I suppose let's put it this way. If I'm to know you as a human being, I have to really be able to grasp what a human being is. That doesn't mean that I'll get it in its fullness. We still deal, especially in empirical stuff, with questions of what it means to be human. We call it anthropology, right? We ask, who do we come from? Are we from Lucy? Is that the sole origin of our existence, or is there something more to us? So we've got all sorts of sort of contingent questions about us. However, I answer the question of what it means to be a human being, and the classical answer is this: we are speaking, talking, reasoning, or thinking animals.
Which has been somewhat complicated by discoveries like today, which, it's like, we now know that dolphins communicate and have their own language,
Sure.
And there are other, albeit more or less advanced, but reasoning beings.
Yeah.
So for many philosophers, especially of the 20th century, that argument just doesn't cut it.
I think most of those philosophers are kind of full of crap. I mean, not that what you have to do is you just have to see it in gradations rather than some absolute distinction, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that nature is unintelligent and we are. It's that there is a gradation of intelligence leading up to, at least we presume, us as the capstone.
That's an incredibly Aristotelian thought, yeah. That's straight out of his De Anima, I think.
Yeah, it is, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There are gradations of all these things, a continual chain of being leading downward and upward that reflect, if you will, divinity in its pure intellect.
Okay.
So let's keep that argument going, right? So unless I can know what your humanity is and actually know it, or if I'm to actually know what your humanity is and grasp really what it is, there has to be an ultimate stability point that allows who you are as the human being to actually be that thing. And it doesn't mean it won't change. It just means that I had to be able to actually grasp what it was at one point in time in its reality to say that I know it. Mm-hmm. John Cobb, he admits as much at the beginning of his introduction to process thought. He says that, how does he say it? That not all things change. For instance, I'd have to actually pull out this book. He puts it in a very interesting way, trying to protect the fact that he wants to, if you will, allow for change in God. But I'm saying changelessness, identity, stable identity, sort of a pure act of being an identity is what we mean by the philosophical concept of God, which classical theism rests on. Now, here's the important part. Whatever other definitions of God we come up with, to the degree that we enter into the act of defining, and to the degree that we enter into the act of trying to make sense of, we are already indirectly invoking Miyagi God in the process, since this God is the God that allows us to recognize, act, think, and understand. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I'm trying to think of like critiques for that.
Yeah.
Because like I agree with you. Yeah. But it's I'm trying to think about the average person who's listening. Um, who's gonna ask the question of like there's
It's a rhetorical.
that's
I
really
think that's
that's
you.
really an argument that's sort of it's almost like the Cartesian circle. Like we have to in
Yeah.
order to be able to define it, we have to rest on the idea that it's already defined.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Something sort of like that.
well, welcome to classical thought. That classical
Yeah. No, yeah.
No, I think
I'm not
you're right.
saying I disagree with it. I'm just like this is the critique.
Let's jump into like the type of critique that we could usher forth, right? This is what Jersey Shore and voluntarism would usher forth.
Right.
They start again with a notion of knowledge. Always, at least in these early stages, we're always beginning with notions of knowledge as we're defining God. Occam says, okay, you say there is a universal humanity that exists somewhere. Augustine, you say it exists in the mind of God. Aquinas, you say that no, it exists in things and God has put it there. And I say this, Scotus says it exists really in the human mind, but not anywhere else. So he's sort of this intermediary. Occam says, forget that. I got Occam's razor here, and I'm going to say that there is no universal. There is merely the way we talk. And the way we talk has to sum things up so that we can actually get through a conversation and not be bogged down in metaphysical language. So he says, here's what things really are. Each thing that you see in this world is its own individual thing. But we got to classify them together through words, through names, so that we can actually get through our conversations together. So universals don't actually exist. You're you, I'm me, the hat's the hat, the cup's the cup, the sun is the sun.
Right.
And there's nothing that is like them. There's nothing that is, if you will, that universal to other hats,
right,
to other humans. There's just convenient classification. So I call it the rhetorical technique. And the rhetorical critique. And it oftentimes comes out today like this. Dude, you can't really mean what you say. And you're making those words up, right?
Right, yeah.
I think the response to that is, well, do you ever mean what you say? That's what I want to always ask. Do you ever mean what you say? Because if you ever mean what you say, you have to think that your words get something correct. You have to think, if you're an Occam, you have to think that you are properly generalizing the notion of language and saying that it only conveniently categorizes things. He thinks that he truly knows that. Or, for instance, if someone tells me that I've only been socialized into thinking that way, I go, well, come on. Then you've merely been socialized into thinking in this particular way, but you still think your words are correct.
And right. And this is like something we'll deal with also later on.
It is, yeah.
Yes.
When we think our words are correct, we think that they grasp something real in the world around us, real identities that we can see amongst other individual things with the same identities. And if we try to deny that, I think we enter into a concrete contradiction of saying, I think I can do that, but you can't.
Right.
So at the end of the day, this is really what Miyagi God in the truest philosophical classical sense is. It is the identity that allows us, even empowers us, to see into the identity of things in the world, grasp them, and interact with them as they are, rather than through, if you will, instinct.
Okay, good. Yeah. See, I brought with me my handy dandy Derrida and Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
So that we can talk about a little bit of that later.
Absolutely.
But anyways, moving on, in still sifting through beer from the suds. Yeah, so we've dealt with sort of having to have this grounding even for the hippie drama circle. But let's talk about this Aquinas quote for a second.
Okay.
God is I'm quoting here. God is his knowing. Our knowing signifies awareness as though it were a quality of things, whereas in God it is his very substance. And knowledge names a disposition not always acknowledged in man, whereas in God it is pure activity. That's got some language in it.
Oh yeah, that's
let's
a heavy.
Yeah,
What
that's
page
a
are you
heavy
on?
one. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's
You got
just talk for the first second. God is his own knowing. What the hell does that mean?
what page are we on so I can
59.
thank you.
God is his own knowing.
So actually Aquinas is doing this famous form of theology here called negative theology. And it takes the things that we do and negates from them the way that we do them. So our knowing, if you will, depends on external things. And it depends on...
Okay.
It depends on us, if you will, being passive to the world around us, at least in part. So we take in information, we begin to sort it out, we try to figure out what it is, and we eventually make a judgment in a sort of aha moment where we go, I get it. Those are the laws of thermodynamics, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What Aquinas is saying is that, look, the classical philosophers get God right. God is, if you will, this active identity, which is intimately tied to knowing. But God's knowing is not passive to the world around it. God isn't sort of in a relationship to objects in the world in the way in which we are. God is the very act of knowing that in knowing things brings them into existence. So God doesn't know externally to God's self. When God knows something, God knows that thing in and through God's self as the source of that thing's identity, existence, essence, whatever you want to call it. That's what he's getting at here.
Yeah, it's like the I was talking with Jason about this, but it's like the Greek word for reckon, which is like, it is the noun, but it is also the verb that brings the noun into existence.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's really good. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what Aquinas is getting at.
Yeah.
When he's just saying that, he's saying God is, God's knowing is not our knowing, because God's knowing brings knowing into existence.
And is the source of our knowing as well. Yeah. I mean, this was the most freeing insight for me in some ways as I first started wrestling with philosophical concepts of God.
That's a good way to ground it. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Whenever we know something, we're already entering into something like an act of prayer, an act of meditative prayer, whereby in knowing what something really is, we get a brief glimpse into the mind of God and God's knowing and how God creates. And I think that's maybe a helpful way to sort of ground, from a Christian perspective, these strange intellectual things. And it was also freeing for me, because then I could, if you will, at a time when I was skeptical, if you will, of secular knowledge, as I would have called it. And there's good reason to be.
Yeah, as one should be.
That's right. But I could take the truths of it without having to be fearful, right? I would just have to recontextualize them, because if they're true in any way whatsoever, they deserve to be reckoned with, because they're already a prayer. They're already a meditation. They already enter into the being of God. Our very thinking itself is a praying, is what this tells me, so that we cannot falsely distinguish anymore between our thinking and our praying.
That's really interesting. So this doesn't have to do with the book at all, but this is just a question. So What then distinguishes, if anything, like prayer that happens in a service?
Yeah.
Versus like the thinking and philosophizing that we're doing right now?
I think that the service is liturgical. It draws us into a story, and we, look, this is one of the reasons I'm Catholic, right? I actually found great meaning in the communal prayers. I found great meaning in the communal service, where everything was done together. In fact, I was frustrated when we switched back to saying I confess my sin instead of we confess our sin. I can't remember where we switched that, but it's in one of the confessions. because in service and in prayer, what we're doing is we're invoking ourselves, being drawn into a story in and through grace. And it's the story of Christ that takes this strange concept of God we're talking about and says it's no longer merely intellect, it's the ground of love. And it's the ground of love that comes not merely to allow you to see things, but allows you to see things as they should be, which we saw first in the garden and primarily in and through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So we make this strange shift in the Christian faith of this philosophical notion of God, which will come out in the later chapters of this book, or the last chapter.
Right. Good. So let's continue in this quote. Let's get the latter part of it. Knowledge names a disposition not always acknowledged in man, whereas in God it is pure activity. Go ahead.
Knowledge names I've thought about this quote. Thank you. Knowledge names a disposition in man. I can't remember how Aquinas is using disposition here. I think it is talking again about that passivity. Namely that we are disposed to knowing, but we don't necessarily have to know. So in other words, I could, does that make sense? So I have to pretend to know.
Yes, but but it's too much of chance for me, you know?
Okay, come back to that point. Let's come back to that point. Let's clarify what this means first of all, right?
Okay.
So when we enter into an act of knowing, again, we are given a phenomenon, we may not.
Let's say tornadoes, for example.
Yeah, tornadoes, right? So
since that might be something you're dealing with.
We first see a tornado and we say, "Oh, I have no clue what this is, but I see clouds swirling. I know the gods live in the clouds." So this has got to be the gods bringing down wrath upon me. We've more or less offered something like a hypothesis that tries to deal to the best of our knowledge and what we currently know with the phenomenon of the tornado, right? So Aristotle used to say of what we now call gravity, he said something like, things by their nature are just like the ground. It's not a very good explanation of gravity. But it's how he tried to explain the phenomenon of things just falling to the ground. It's in their nature.
That had more to do with his explanation of the primordial elements. And
exactly.
Fire goes up, matter falls down.
Exactly, yeah. Fire is drawn toward the heavens. Water is more material, is drawn toward the earth, right?
Yeah.
We have these worldviews, and as we try to come to know the truth of the world around us, we don't do so in some pure bubble of pure intellection, as if we can know the truth of the world purely, simply, and without any equivocation. Rather, we're given over to worldviews, and we begin explaining the world the best we can by what we know. So we're an ancient Greek denizen, and we explain the tornadic clouds by way of Zeus, right? And then you have old Anaxagoras who comes around and says, well, what do you mean by the gods? And can the gods actually live in the clouds? Doesn't that just make them like really powerful people? Shouldn't we think of the gods in some other way? And you start thinking about it, you go, it's a good point. So then what causes the tornadoes? And so then you begin paying attention to the periphery phenomenon around the tornadic weather, and you try to come up with other hypotheses until you come up with, and I still don't think we have a perfect explanation of a tornado, we come up with weather currents, we come up with hot air, moist air versus, and pressure. I won't pretend like I know weather science, okay? Let's just move on from that. Come up with a better explanation of it, right?
Right.
And so we are constantly oriented toward, driving toward, grasping the truth without probably ever getting things entirely correct. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then, God, who knows in and through God's self is the pure act of identity, simply knows things in their truth because God grounds the truth itself. So this is part of the distinction. We are only disposed toward knowing, which is knowing things in their truth. God knows things in their truth by way of God's self.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
You're going to bore people with these epistemic questions about Aquinas, man. Come on.
All right. Well, let's move on then. Just rummaging through my notes here.
Don't take that last comment seriously, David.
I know. Okay. We're trying to make the epistemic more fun.
Yeah, that's right. We're bringing
the idea.
Sexy back to epistemology.
Yeah. So on page 62, you talk a little bit about using truth for means of oppression, and things along those lines, and especially in the context of, if God is the ultimate truth, but we use it to justify other things, like oppression. So this obviously is a very sensitive topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to ask you the question.
Yeah, please.
Which is, how do we know when we're using it correctly?
Truth.
Truth and God in that truth. Yes.
Oh, that's a risk we always take, right? I mean, life in this regard is a risk, because while we know we have to be oriented toward truth, so let me make this argument first.
And also, I'm asking that in the context of when you say any truth can be oppressive or free and can be used as a cattle prod or a key to a mind's gate, an understanding of God can yield a curt and off-putting side or a sensitive and loving side. So we're trying to find what that line is.
Yeah, we're trying to. I don't think we can predefine that. One of the major issues that I have with how we do theology today is that we try to predefine this line, and that's at least from the philosophical side, that's hard to do. Theologically, it's a little easier to do, because you can ask the simple question: did you treat the waiter or waitress with a sense of dignity? No? Okay, then you have sinned against Christ because you have sinned against a fellow creature.
Right.
It's easier to do from the theological side. Philosophically, we can't draw these lines so easily. Mm-hmm. We have to jump in and see where the questions unfold themselves. So let's talk political correctness for a second, and then its usual critique, right?
Okay.
I know, seriously. Well, philosophy gets awkward quickly.
I mean, we wanted to make it more interesting, so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Here we go.
Political correctness today oftentimes tries to pre-draw these types of lines. You can talk about this, you cannot talk about this, you are not allowed to ask these types of questions, but you should ask these questions. I think that's intellectual obscurantism, and I think it cuts off in us a drive, if you will, toward freedom to see into the truth of any and all things, that in such a way that it's not merely defined by our current cultural motifs. The usual critique is to be an asshole, right? So you get the sort of Trump-esque rhetoric that simply tries to critique political correctness by saying outlandish things that alas, people have begun to take seriously, unfortunately. Right. Well, I think the only way to talk, and I'm not saying that I can do this or you can do it. Socrates did it. Christ did it. And Socrates worse than Christ because I'm Christian. But
there we go. Good.
The only way to barter, the only way to shoot through this is to simply open up and ask any question that comes to mind, trying to come up with an honest answer to that, right? Mm-hmm. So we give ourselves in, if you will, to the infinite set of questions that we might gain. In other words, we're trying to continually intellectually give ourselves over to the mind of God, understanding that whatever we think we might know at any given point in time probably only sees a grain of the truth. Mm-hmm. I mean, so whether I can draw that line, I can't do that. But what I can do is what I think is important is to foster a proper intellectual attitude. Seek the truth, pursue the truth, ask any and all questions, whether you think they're stupid or good, and whether they are socially acceptable or not. Be kind in the process, I suppose I'd say as well.
Yeah, because that's often I feel the like people talk about political correctness and then it's equated with like you're not being nice to me. But
Yeah.
yeah, but the essence of it is just like I am being inquisitive and like
Mhm.
there are questions that I don't know answers to and want to have the answer to.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
but it has to be done almost in like an ethical, like Christian way.
I think so. But I want to make sure that we understand kindness in a proper context here. It doesn't mean cutting yourself off from real answers.
Right.
And that may cut against social grain. It may not also. That's the problem with our social concepts of things. What we call common sense is what I would call oftentimes bullshit. In a technical philosophical sense. It may be true, it may not be true, but we don't know one way or another until we're willing to jump in and try to figure it out for ourselves.
Right.
So we have to still be willing to give ourselves over to those questions, but wherever we end up on, say, issues of transgender, for instance, like a very hot topic of the current, you should be able to ask any questions you need to ask of that. Explore it, try to do it with openness to anyone and everyone. What I think you're saying, what I completely affirm, is if you come against it, whatever that would mean, you can't then go out and be a jerk to people, right?
Right.
If you affirm it, I don't know if that's the right way to even say this, so that's silly sounding. You also can't be a jerk to people somehow, some way. So yeah, I think we can take out the usual political ways in which we pursue knowledge, which is I want to win. I want to force you into agreeing with me. I want to submit you to what I've come to agree with. Mm-hmm. We take that out, and then we get to pursue real questions instead of just trying to make our side win.
Yeah. It's very much like with the Quaker motto of like wanting a mutual understanding.
Yeah.
Rather than like someone coming out on top.
That's right. Which, by the way, may never come. My wife and I still disagree on things that will likely always.
This is marriage.
Yeah, that's right. Amen. I'm right. Can you delete that part? I'd appreciate that.
I don't know if I can. I think that's too. I think that's like the content people are looking for here.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Anyways, I digress. Let's move on a little bit.
Yep.
Because at this point, I'm not even sure we're gonna make it through chapter 4.
Oh, we'll make it. Got this.
The highest reality doesn't need any reality lower than himself.
Yep.
You say that on page 63. What does that say for Christians about the creation story?
It means for Christians, this is when Christians come back. So the Greeks said, so God doesn't think about creation. It's an automatic, what we'd call emanation. Things just come into being and God doesn't care. God just continually thinks through how rad it is to be God, right? That's all God is doing all day long in this eternal moment of God's unity. What Christians do is they reinterpret it and say, no, God came to us. God became incarnate. That means that God in some ways cares for this creation, but it also means that God doesn't need to care for creation. God is in fact a grace, a gift, and this creation is a gift. And we should recognize ourselves as not needing to be, but being brought into being in such a way that God wants to be with us, not for God's sake, but for our sake. So I have a critique of what I call theologies of glory, right? And I think I wrote a blog for this for Trip called Theologies of Glory Suck Donkey Butt. Great title. It's going to go viral.
That's a very Jason title.
It is indeed. And what a theology of glory does is say that God created all this so that God could look at it and then say to God's self, I am awesome. I am just the coolest being to ever have been. I think a true Christian theology, which is bound up with gift and grace, looks at God and says, God didn't need to create and opted into creating. So why did God do this? Well, because God wanted to be with us. Did God want to be with us because God needed us? No, 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 no. God wanted to give the gift of existing to other beings and then allow them to be in communion. So it's all selflessness, self-outpouring, kenosis, as Paul talks about it, rather than some sort of solipsistic, self-referential God. This is what Christians do to the ancient concept of God, rightly, I think, through Christ and proper understanding of Christ.
David Bentley Hart gave a great talk on kenosis and the incarnation and the aesthetics of it. Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
There's nothing that he does that isn't.
Oh, I know. You know, yeah. Consider this sacrilegious, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was Jesus.
He is the second coming. He's we can at least be Aryan about him. Well, I might have to be Aryan about Mary, that she's the firstborn of created beings. But maybe he can be like the secondborn.
Yeah. That's
super nerdy theology.
No, that's a good.
Sorry, everyone.
That's a good statement. I think we can agree on that. I hope he's listening. Anyways, moving on. So you say proponents of hippie aunt God conceive of her as existing in time and in a constant state of relational becoming with her creation. That's dense. But there's also, and I think you acknowledge this, but the critique is that, and I think Dave Bentley Hart would agree here, is that God can't be in and of time and of creation, right?
Yep.
So with that in mind, why don't you explain this conception in hippie aunt God?
So process thinkers try to have their cake and eat it too. They want a God who is really defined by a relationship to the world, but really still offers some sort of steady ground for the world to be. And so there's it's been a while since I've done serious process thought, so this is going to be difficult for me to do. We may have to. I may have to look at this and come back to it.
It's okay. Do it your best. Do your best. Yeah, I don't want to make you revisit process theology. I don't want to put you through that.
Tripp writes on page 66, Whitehead argues that while God changes in relationship to each moment, God's character never changes. God's greatest limitation is God's infinite, unwavering love.
I was actually going to ask you about that right after this.
Well, it
just seems there's stuff there.
Yeah, well, there is stuff there, but what I'm personally saying is this. If we're going to say that God is infinite, unwavering love, let's quit cutting God off from that love and say that God is identical with that unwavering love for us, so that there is an indistinct relationship between the love that is God and the act of love and who God is. But I think process theologians have to say God has this character of love, just like we have a character, but also has a body in which that character is enacted, which comes out into a relationality with the world. Does that, or something like, I don't want to say a body. The world is God's body in some ways. So I say, maybe one place I agree with Occam. Why don't you just snip that off? Understand that if we're going to talk about the unwavering love, we don't need to subject God to the categories of finitude, of change, of relationality, as good as it might feel to do so at certain points in time.
Right.
And I think that's what it comes down to, that and a real and important argument from the problem of evil. But we can rather say God is this unwavering love. what I want to say mostly to process theologians is go full Buddhist or go home. And what I mean by that is the following, and we're skipping the chapter called "Leave the Buddhists Alone" already.
Right.
But
So maybe this is a time to give a little bit of a rundown there.
Yeah. So in that chapter, here's what I argue. When we get sick of Christianity, the go-to religion of the day is Buddhism, which I say we turn into Christianity light. If you want to actually interact with a different religion, I think that we ought to do it from the Christian standpoint of love, which takes their categories, their ways of thinking prior to our own, such that we can enter into their ways of thought and learn from them and try to draw something back into the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. That's the essential argument that I have for that. But what we oftentimes do with Buddhism is say that, hey, it's like Christianity, only I can smoke a ton of pot, eat pizza all day long while watching Netflix. That's kind of what we do with Buddhism. I'm just not sure that's what Buddhists are up to.
Yeah.
What Buddhists, at least Zen Buddhists, I think are up to, and this is interesting, and why I like to throw this accusation at process theologians. They say everything is a conditioned reality. I don't think that process theologians will necessarily disagree with that. Also say
what does that mean? What does that mean?
So nothing is a self-caused existence. If God is being itself, God is a self-caused existence.
Okay.
That's one way we could say.
Good.
Everything is conditioned, so that there are any number of conditions that bring other things into reality, right? Mm-hmm. So probably semi-enslaved workers in China bring my iPad and this iMac into existence. I ought to repent of that, and I do oftentimes. There are other, they were brought into existence by their parents. Everything is a conditioned unfolding and a constant process of unfolding.
Right.
But they also say that very statement itself is a conditioned reality. So that it's not a self-grounding true statement. Mm-hmm. It is rather a conditioned reality that cannot be latched onto. So it's a pragmatic move Buddhists make. They say, that's why I think my favorite saying from Zen is, if you see a Buddha on the road, kill him. Because you're not supposed to attach yourself to his doctrine. You're supposed to use it as a raft to get you across the river into enlightenment, and then be able to give up attachment to him and all other things. Huh. So I want to say to process.
I haven't explored Buddhism that much at all. Yeah, so I'm really learning here. Yeah, no, it's good.
I want to say to process theologians, give up your attachment to truth, and instead enter into the full pragmatism of Buddhist thought, which detaches you from care and concern for all these things. Or if you are concerned with truth, recognize that it could only come to be by way of an unconditioned reality of some sort. Mm-hmm. So it's that's my sort of status quo critique, nothing new there, of process theologians.
Good. On the next page, 67, and this is part of why I brought in Wittgenstein and Derrida.
Yeah.
You say, incomprehensibility means that Miyagi God is so rad and has such a cool Harley that you can't come close to grasping who he is in his fullness. This inability doesn't mean that God can't be grasped in principle as the most basic concept. Miyagi God is the most knowable reality in all the cosmos. So,
go for it.
Is that simply a fault of our language?
That we can't know God in God's fullness?
Yeah.
I don't know if it has to. So let's imagine.
Let's operate off the principle that it does have to do with language. And then after that we can.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Yes, it is a fault, or if you will, I don't want to use the term fault because it makes it sound like language is a bad thing. It is an inherent limitation of language.
Okay.
But then we got to ask ourselves, what is language and what does language do? It is a mode of articulating the world that allows us to communicate and see the world for what it is, or at least attempt to. So when we articulate in and through words, we are
World as representation.
I don't know. It depends on how you take representation. I don't want to get into the technical side of.
Yeah, let's actually not do that. Just forget I said that.
Well, let's say this: when we articulate the world, when we articulate realities, there's not some mirror image going back and forth whereby we get it all right. This is where I take Derrida and Wittgenstein seriously. Mm-hmm. Rather, we are in some ways entering into a creative articulation of the world, and we do it one way in, say, Western culture that isn't done in Eastern culture. And a sort of cross-cultural pollination is helpful in this way because we see one another's articulations that emerge from the assumptions that our language has, and then we articulate the world as such. The problem comes in when we say that there's nothing real in those articulations. Even if we get things wrong, even if we don't know things in their full truth, to say that we know nothing is a falsehood. Because already then we're saying that we know something, namely that we know nothing, right? So I think that's an inherently contradictory sentiment. So is there something inherently at fault in language? No, it's just finite. Just like, and it's who we are, and we are finite, and we don't know this world in its fullness, and we especially then don't even know the God who is not the same as the world but grounds the world in God's fullness. Even if God is inherently knowable. After all, God, if Thomas talks about God, God sits around knowing himself for all eternity and then brings us into creation by knowing himself. That sounds dirty somehow. Sorry. Inappropriate joke.
Oh my gosh.
We're going to other religions.
That just came out of left field, man. I had no idea you were going there.
I apologize.
No. You're all good. I just know my mom's gonna hate me for laughing at that.
Oh, my mom's gonna hate me for saying it.
Oh man. Yeah. Anyways. Good. That's a aside. Dirty joke aside. Good explanation.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. Let's move on. Page 70. We're at the end of the chapter now.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about whether it is logically right or if we can even comprehend it logically to have this synthesis of relationality on the grounds of incomprehensibility.
Yeah, so what I argue...
So let's just recap before we do that. Let's just recap, what do we mean by relationality? What do we mean by incomprehensibility? And why am I having problems with reconciling those logically?
Here's what I'm ultimately arguing for, okay? I say we start always with the Miyagi concept of God, and I think we have to start there because to do otherwise is self-contradictory. It's already to invoke the name of Miyagi, whether we mean to or not.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that I got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So when I take up defining God and I start to do so, and here I'm saying, look, Miyagi is a great place to start, but if I only was concerned with Miyagi God, I would become something like a pragmatic atheist. Who cares at the end of the day? Me, I care because I was a Platonist, strangely, at one point in time, and I have this a spiritual notion of the idea of truth, right? But most people are going to say, so what? Who cares? And I actually agree. But when we enter into the Christian definitions, which I'm assuming we're going to get into probably in the next session, right?
Yeah, probably.
I think we have to have more categories at our disposal. And the reason is this. God enters into time as a contingent or unnecessary human being, as in some ways becoming a part of the creation that God has grounded. that means that there is relationship between God in God's eternality and us in our time. And I think that we have to come up with some way to make sense of that, especially if, as we're going to do when we begin dealing rightly with the problem of evil through partially the concept of human freedom, we say that there is freedom on our behalves, that God did not predetermine from all eternity. We have to have some sort of categories that allow for a relational give and take on the part of God and us. Now, that might mean that what God does is all of, if you will, creation unfolds in a singular moment for God, but there's still a sense in which God can, if you want to put it this way, will to hold back, so as to allow creation to do its own thing.
Okay.
And I think in some ways we will have to assert that while at one and the same time asserting God's eternality. And we come up with this strange category called eternal contingency. I won't get into that technical idea. I'm writing a paper on that right now. I know, don't go crazy, crowd. I don't want you to get too excited. I'm writing a paper on eternal contingency right now.
No, I'd love to see that.
You got it. I'll send it to you.
No, please do. Yeah.
So yeah, it's not easy, and yet from a Christian perspective, which I'm beginning to take now, we have to see something like relationship and relationship at stake. We don't change God, but there's a real relationship in some ways.
Right. It's an invitation.
Yeah, an invitation to become something better, and even a causation, something like causation, whereby God is restructuring the world in and through Christ, and even in time when we can't see it. This is the ultimate paradox of the Christian faith.
Right.
We live in a kingdom that has come in part, but is not here in full, and it's not always easy to see.
Yeah, yeah. I want to be respectful of your time.
Oh yeah, we're good, man.
Since we are getting close.
Yeah.
In all honesty, I think we should probably just call it there instead of attempting to jump into chapter 7.
Sure. Yeah. That's.
I don't think we're going to be able to do it justice in 10 minutes.
Let's do a brief recap, okay? Because this might be one way to get over some of the tech. We went over the sort of technical side of things.
Good.
But I think if I'm in these first chapters, if I'm to draw anything out of people, this is what I'm trying to draw out of them. We have all been raised in a sort of semi or quasi-fundamentalist interpretation of the Christian faith. Now, it doesn't mean your parents raised you that way. It's this sort of cultural milieu that defines what it means to be Christian, right? So that you have people like Dawkins who say, if you don't believe the tenets of these fundamentalist beliefs, you're not actually Christian.
Right.
What I'm trying to do here, and through these very philosophical analyses and concepts of God, is show you the power you have to break through these cultural definitions of who you must be as a Christian and how you must conceive of God. You think of God as a shredded old man river, cosmic vending machine, throwing down lightning bolts and hating gay people, for instance. Well, maybe it's time to rethink these categories in and through some philosophical lenses. Even if, and I mean this, even if those philosophical lenses are not good enough at the end of the day for a Christian. So let this talk, let these real intellectual pursuits and developments of the concept of God draw you into a world you didn't otherwise know, and let it take you. And quit telling yourself that's just a bunch of rhetoric. No. It's anything but just a bunch of rhetoric. It is entering into a reality beyond the common sense bullshit that we're defined by on an average everyday basis.
Good. That was weirdly motivating, but loved it.
Good.
Loved it. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So we will be back next week to take on, and I'll try and like segment out in like 15-minute segments so that we can actually get through,
Sweet.
A good chunk of material so that we don't get too behind.
Yeah.
But thank you for your time as always.
Thank you, David. Thank you, folks.
Send me that paper.
When it's done, it'll be August.
Okay. Cool.
I'll send it to you.
Great. So good talking to you as always.
Yeah, man.
And we will see you next week.
Okay. Talk to you later, David.
Bye.
Bye.